the circle of friends that my parents had were mostly engineers, which makes it real interesting. Most of the other Downwinders I know were not from engineering families. I'm one of the few Downwinders I know who had a dad who was actually an engineer. There were pipe layers families and construction workers families who were Downwinders. I'm the only one I've met whose dad was actually an engineer, which is interesting because all of our friends were engineers. So it gives you a different perspective. When we moved to San Jose, California from Hanford, a lot of the engineers transferred at the same time to San Jose or to Oak Ridge. So that's where their friends went. They went to San Jose or Oak Ridge. Now, last Christmas, my mom was still alive last Christmas. She died in March. I was going to Oak Ridge for a meeting, and my mom said, hey, you could visit our old friends there and see how they are. And she listed 6 couples. I think it was 6 or 5. And she says, you could visit so-and-so. I have the address here. She looks in her book, and she goes, oh, they're dead. That's right, they're both dead. She says, and she kept doing this. She goes, he died of liver cancer. And she just kept saying, no, they're dead. No, that's right, they died. And she didn't say, oh my God, they all died. She just went, they're all dead. Well, I guess you don't have to visit any of them. It's just like she didn't think it remarkable that they were all dead. So I said, okay, well, I won't visit any of them then. And then our neighbors in Richland, next door neighbors, the mother has cancer, the dad has cancer. Then my babysitter from Richland has severe thyroid disease. She's contacted me a number of times. But there's this incredible number of my parents' colleagues who are dead of cancer, and my parents never thought it remarkable. Almost makes you feel like you're in it's a test to see if you're going to go nuts or not to have these people. They just didn't want to put 2 and 2 together and say everybody's dead of cancer. Isn't that weird? Yes, it is weird. And now you're both dead of cancer, Mom and Dad, and they are, from just the strangest, fast-moving cancers. Whew. So if you could put all my parents' friends together, there would be just 2 to 3% of them alive still. It is so amazing.
Now, you moved out of that area. What was the last level of school you were in when you moved down?
Well, we moved out of the area when I was still in elementary school, okay. But my grandmother lived in Spokane, so we kept coming back. That was in the Downwind area. We kept coming back all the time. So I didn't really leave the Downwind area in 1960 when we moved. We kept coming back all the time, and I lived there part of the time and stuff. So I don't consider the exposures as having ended then. Yeah. So I guess one thing that I feel like there's been an effort by the Department of Energy, whether intentional or not, I feel probably intentional, to not have the American public understand that you have to see all these sites as one picture, and to never have a whole bunch of us in one place at once. Because if you do, you start seeing stuff like I just mentioned. All my parents' friends are dead of cancer. Or you put 200 of us that were all in Richland when I was together, I bet you'd find 65 to 70% of them have thyroid disease or something else. But you don't see us all in one place, so you don't realize the impact. We do have an archives project over there at Gonzaga, that's where it's housed, pulling in all the information from Hanford Downwinders, trying to put it in one place. The problem is there are a lot of Downwinders who don't want to send their information in because it's funded through, it starts with DOE funds, then comes through the Hanford Health Information Network, and now it's funded by ATSDR funds. The Downwinders are really worried because it's a governmental funding source. And how do I convince folks that it's real important to put this all in one place? So we've got thousands of people's health information over there. It's a big, amazing picture.
What's your reaction to that? Because we've obviously interviewed other Downwinders and such, and they're to the point where they feel they're basically been guinea pigs for the bulk of and
Yeah.
they're tired, they don't want to participate in another study where they're just going to be another, they're going to be put through the maze one more time. They just want a study that they get to call the shots on, with their people in there and such. Maybe not at 100% level, but at least participating and stuff. What's your reaction to that?
Well, have you had actual suggestions from folks as to what type of study they feel would work? I ask you that question because I've heard lots of variations on that. I'm trying to get a fix on what.
I'm trying to remember what the summation on that. Remember that meeting we sat through that was...
Pendleton?
Yeah, it was the last meeting at Pendleton, and it was...
Yeah, that's an emotional group of folks.
Yeah.
You know what, some of the folks, here's what some of the people say. They say, go away, don't study us anymore. But then they say, give us medical care. What I say in response is, medical care for which diseases are you stating? Because in my mind, I think it's very reasonable to ask for medical care for diseases plausibly related to the radionuclides to which people were exposed. But you got to figure out what the sort of overall exposures were so you know who got nailed worst, essentially. Who's at highest risk. Once you hone in on what was released and how much was released, then you can figure out who's at highest risk. Then you could, very logically, it makes sense to give people free care for the diseases plausibly related to those exposures. But if you don't think through the step A to B to C to D like that, and you just say, give us medical care or give us compensation, then I say, which people do you give a compensation to? Because how do you tell which ones really got those exposures? Which diseases are you going to treat for? Do I get treated for a broken leg just because I was in the exposure area? Now, you could do that if you had national health care. But we tried that. Hillary Clinton got shot down on that already. Now, there's a program for the hibakusha in Japan, people exposed to the bombs from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where if they show they were in the exposure area, if they can verify that, like with 2 witnesses or whatever, there's some procedure, then they get all this medical care. Broad spectrum. I don't believe any disease is excluded. I may be wrong on that, but I believe it's full spectrum medical care. That's another way to do it, but I don't see our government doing that because they're really resisting national health care. So that when those folks say, give us medical care, give us compensation, have they specified which folks should get that, which shouldn't? You know, what are the eligibility criteria? And which diseases are plausibly related and which aren't? Because I think that's important to put that in there somewhere. Otherwise it's not fair.
Most of them seem to be reacting to the Hutchinson study and how it defined most of them out of the, off the critical list or off the,
yeah, I wasn't in the study.
Right. I think that was kind of like the straw that broke a lot of them, well, how can we trust you after that?
Yeah. Well, we were talking a bit about the Hanford thyroid disease study a little bit ago, because one of the premises of the design of the study was that they would look for a dose response. The premise was if you had people exposed to higher amounts of radioiodine, you would find more incidence of thyroid disease and cancer amongst those folks than you would amongst those exposed to lower amounts. Then they took the people who they thought at highest risk, because they thought the highest emissions were in the 1944, 45, 46 time period. We now know there may have been some very high emissions in the early 50s. This information has not been made public yet, and it needs to be. But so they assumed at that time that the highest peaks were in the 45, 46 time period. They picked the people exposed during that time that were young. They picked a bunch of people in certain header areas that were exposed during that time. But what they didn't deal with was all these confounders like Nevada test site radioiodine that was coming out in the 50s. These people got nailed by that too, particularly if they lived in Idaho. A bunch of radioiodine came over there. The test Bravo from the Marshall Islands in the mid-50s that came from west to east and hit people in these study areas. How do you figure out what the real doses were on folks if they got hit from 3 directions. And how could you possibly compare people's incidence of thyroid disease one to the other when you don't know what their real doses were, so you can't compare the doses? Another thing is they found a very, very significant incidence of thyroid disease in the cohort that was studied. That did not come out in their media stuff. It didn't come out in the published materials for the public. What it said was, don't find a dose response. And then a lot of the media interpreted that as meaning there was no harm from Hanford's radioiodine. So the National Academies of Science review that's ongoing right now of the Hanford thyroid disease study includes a review of how the results of this study were portrayed and communicated to the public. People like me were sort of found out from the, I guess it was the Wall Street, no, it was the New York Times article. It said no thyroid harm from Hanford, and I got all these calls from the media. Nobody had briefed me ahead of time. I had no idea what was going on. They hadn't even had the public meeting yet to inform people. So I was suddenly going, what? That's impossible. It's really impossible because that doesn't reflect reality. So it took a while to figure out that this study at best was inconclusive. What they should have said was, because of these confounders, the Nevada test site radioiodine, the Marshall Islands radioiodine, we can't really figure out what the doses were, so we can't compare doses and incidence of thyroid disease. We found a significant percentage of people with thyroid diseases, and here's the numbers, and they could have given the numbers out, and said, the best we can do is say this study was inconclusive. We tried our best, we did the best we could, we tried to set this up logically. Nobody would have been upset with them, it would have been honest. Instead, they said, you guys don't worry about your thyroid harm from Hanford. How can they tell that to a person like me whose dad has died of thyroid cancer? I have thyroid disease, my mother had thyroid disease, hyperparathyroidism, and they're dead. You can't, so that is why we are being vocal about this, and that is why the National Academies of Science review is very important. And I'm hoping they will have a public meeting and discuss their findings. And I'm thankful that this includes the communications aspect.
If anything, the Hutchinson study only really raised more questions, didn't it?
Yes, if it had been fairly and honestly portrayed, it would have said just what you said. It raises more questions. It's inconclusive. Yes, we found a lot of thyroid disease in this group, but because of these confounders like Nevada test site radioiodine, Marshall Islands radioiodine, it's difficult to look for a dose response. But what they can look for is clusters of disease. For example, my family has no history of thyroid disease yet. 4 out of 4 members of my family developed thyroid disease. We lived in the downwind area of Hanford where the radioiodine was. You can look at the families. There are lots of families with multiple incidents of thyroid disease. They lived in the downwind area.
Without any history.
Correct. No family history of thyroid disease. Now there is a very interesting thing to look at, that would make sense. So there are some steps that we might want to take next that would be much more meaningful than taking an epidemiologic study that's set up to find nothing because of the confounders. I don't blame the researchers. I think they tried very hard, and they were very surprised that they didn't find a dose response. But they also didn't know about the extent of the Nevada test site radioiodine when they set the study up. That came out later. Lots of confounders came up after they started. So.
What would be the next logical steps to take?
Well, first of all, I want, and many people want, the National Academies of Science review to be discussed in a public meeting where the media is invited, the public need to be there. It needs to be given equal weight to the briefing that they had when the Hanford thyroid disease study results were announced. After that review is made public, and I don't know what it'll say, so we have to wait and see, the next logical step, I think, is to look at the clusters of disease. Like I mentioned, the whole families that have been affected by thyroid disease where there's no family history of it other than the people that live in the downwind area. That's a logical thing to do. I would also like there to be a public retraction of the statement made in the I think it's the executive summary of the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study where it says, "Be reassured, you people who lived in the downwind area, your thyroid health hasn't been harmed by Hanford." I think that's out of line, and it's insulting to the memory of people like my dad. I think they need to publicly retract that, and I've asked for that twice already. And they kept saying, "No, we're not going to do that unless there's some reason to do so." So.
Which should be a public outcry, enough pressure.
I think that they're waiting to see what the National Academies of Science says about the way this study was communicated. I think one of the things that happened is that Fred Hutchinson and CDC didn't want to get into a public sort of squabble over the way the study was presented. I think CDC was in private, the folks from CDC would tell us that they felt some of those statements contained in the executive summary that were written by the Fred Hutch researchers were a bit extreme, and they wouldn't have written the things that way. So that you have two agencies disagreeing but not wanting to get into a public battle over it. And so we are the ones who are suffering as a result.